the Iliad and the Odyssey. And this piece that we're going to read today is the Odyssey, although we'll review the Iliad real quick. So it is technically part two, the Odyssey part. Here's a picture of the Trojan horse. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, had been away from his home for more than 9 years now. He missed his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus terribly. Yet, because of a promise he'd made a long time ago, he had to leave his kingdom for the Trojan War. The Trojan War all began with a beautiful woman named Helen. She was married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. The two were happy together. But since Helen was the prettiest woman in the world, she naturally had a lot of suitors. While most of them moved on after she got married, Paris, who was a Trojan prince, had refused to give up on her. With the help of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, he made Helen fall in love with him. The two eloped. They got married in secret. Menelaus was determined to get Helen back. He called on all of Helen's former admirers and reminded them of a vow that they made on his wedding day. He demanded they honor it by going to Troy with him and fighting the Trojans. Since Odysseus had once been spellbound by Helen's beauty, he was now obligated to join the war. He didn't really want to go, but there was nothing he could do. For nearly a decade, the Greeks held Troy under siege. They hoped that the Trojans would surrender, but that day never came. Aside from the never-ending standoff, the Greeks had quite a few problems of their own. Their commander-in-chief, Agamemnon, Menelaus's brother and king of Mycenae, was a terrible leader. One day he got into a big fight with his best warrior, Achilles. In the end, Achilles left the Greek camps in disgust. He swore that he would never come back. The Trojans were elated with the news, as they soon began to make progress. As much as Achilles detested Agamemnon, he never changed his mind, or he eventually did change his mind. Upon his return, he replaced Agamemnon, and he became the new commander-in-chief. His first order of business was to avenge the death of his friend Patroclus. He challenged Hector, Paris's brother and a great Trojan hero, and he slew him. One day, Ajax, Odysseus, and Achilles managed to sneak behind Troy's heavy guarded gates, but they were soon exposed. With Apollo standing by his side as a guide, Paris shot an arrow into Achilles' only weak spot, his heel, and it killed him instantly. Ajax and Odysseus retreated in haste and returned to their camps with Achilles' body. The Greeks were stunned by this loss. They thought that Achilles was immortal, but he had just died, so they realized he wasn't. After burying Achilles next to Patroclus, they awarded his sacred armor to Odysseus. This nice gesture turned out to be a big disaster. It made Ajax mad. He couldn't fathom why his fellow countrymen wouldn't bestow him that honor. Plagued by nightmares and jealousy, he eventually killed himself. Several weeks after Ajax committed suicide, Paris was dead too. Menelaus was delighted by the news. He thought the war was over. I mean, it was he and Paris who were fighting, but he was wrong. Deiphobus, Paris's brother, had fallen in love with Helen. Now he forced her to marry him, and so the war dragged on. Eager to end the conflict once and for all, Odysseus mulled over all the available options. He knew that if only the Greeks could get into Troy undetected, they could win the war. The problem was, of course, how to do that. Odysseus racked his brain day and night. At last, he came up with a brilliant solution. He shared the idea with his comrades. Everybody thought it was a brilliant idea too. With the blessing of the entire Greek force, Odysseus set off to work on it right away. One morning, the Trojans awoke and found the Greeks gone. They saw a huge wooden horse dedicated to Athena, abandoned out in the open. They hauled it back into the city, but they had no idea what to make of it. Later, they caught Sinon, Odysseus' cousin, and took him prisoner. They peppered him with a lot of questions. Sinon told the Trojans that the Greeks had a falling out with Athena, the goddess of wisdom. To appease the angry deity, they made an imposing statue for her before they set sail to Greece. The story elated the Trojans. They couldn't believe how lucky they were. While some remained suspicious, their opinions were quickly cast down as crazy. That night, the Trojans held a great feast to celebrate their victory. After 10 long, agonizing years, the Trojan War was finally over. At the height of the party, Sinon slipped out and lit a beacon. Agamemnon saw the signal and ordered his men to quietly approach Troy from a nearby island. In the meantime, a secret door was swung open in the belly of the wooden horse. The Greek soldiers, fully armored, climbed down the statue. They opened the gates and let Agamemnon's troops in. Together, they joined forces and launched a surprise attack. The Trojans, who were now very drunk because they were celebrating, were unable to fight. Most of them died without even knowing what was happening. When Odysseus and Menelaus got down from the wooden horse, they headed straight to the palace. There, Menelaus killed Deiphobus and reunited with Helen. Odysseus then set the palace on fire. He and the other Greek soldiers killed every Trojan in sight. By the time they were done sacking Troy, its citizens were either dead or dragged away as slaves. Only Antenor and his family members were spared. They were the lucky few because Antenor, who was once a member of the Trojan Council, had helped Odysseus, Menelaus, and Acamas escape Troy 10 years earlier when the trio had gone there to the city as ambassadors, but trying to avoid war, right? Now with Helen back in Menelaus' arms and Troy completely leveled, the Greeks were ready to go home. Odysseus was excited, for he had been longing for this moment since he'd left Ithaca. He figured that the journey would take a few days, but it wasn't meant to be. Shortly after Odysseus left Troy, a violent storm drove his ship off course, thus setting off a series of adventures. To find his way home, Odysseus dealt with one obstacle after another. He blinded a cyclops, a one-eyed man-eating giant, which you see in the picture there. He visited a dead prophet in the underworld, and he saw many of his former comrades there, since a lot of them had died in war, right? He watched his men being swallowed alive by a hideous six-headed monster called Scylla. He heard sirens and chanting songs, and had to fight the urge to swim ashore, for the music would lead him into a death trap. After these and several more near-death experiences, Odysseus finally made it home 9 years later. So 10 years of fighting and then 9 years of journeying home. He actually doesn't die. He wounds the Cyclops, Polyphemus. To Odysseus's dismay, his palace of Ithaca was in disarray. During his time away, many young men came and proposed to his beautiful wife, Penelope. Faithful as she was, Penelope turned them all down. But those shameless suitors refused to take no for an answer. So they came to the palace every day. They ate and drank and entertained, all at Penelope's expense. Penelope and her son Telemachus were very angry, but there was nothing they could do. For years, they heard nothing from Odysseus. They did not know if he was dead or alive. Telemachus even ventured to Sparta and to Pylos to try to get some information about his father, but nothing turned up. The people there were like, yeah, we saw him in Troy. He was fine. He was heading home. Wonder what happened to him. Then one day, an old beggar came to the palace. He told Penelope and Odysseus that Odysseus was on his way home. What he didn't tell her was that he, the old beggar himself, was Odysseus. Penelope received the old beggar cordially. She did not know the visitor was her husband, but how could she? Odysseus had aged considerably in the past 19 years. By now, his appearance had changed completely. Odysseus didn't blame Penelope for not recognizing him. He sat quietly in the palace and observed the situation. Later, Penelope devised a new plan to dissuade the suitors. She told them about a trick that Odysseus used to do before the war. She said that she would marry the man who could shoot an arrow through a line of 12 axes, like her husband had once done. Just as she predicted, all those young lads failed miserably. Then all of a sudden, the old beggar stood up and asked if he could try too. He took the bow into his hands, flexed it a bit, and calmly shot an arrow through the line of 12 axes. The palace hall fell dead silent. The old beggar then whirled around and killed all of Penelope's suitors. Even after the deed was done and the bodies were taken away, Penelope still had her doubts. In one final attempt to attest his identity, the old beggar revealed a secret that only she and Odysseus would know. He told her that the bed in their bedroom was carved out of a giant living olive tree. Imagine an actual tree in your bedroom. They carved a bed out of it or into it. Upon hearing these words, Penelope broke into tears. She needed no more proof. Nobody knew about that but them, right? She knew now that the old beggar was indeed Odysseus. At last, after 19 years, her beloved husband had come back to her. She could have not have asked for a better ending than that. All right, that's your story, and now you're answering the questions that follow.